Hey, my name is Matt, and this is the scape of the iPro tank. Just like any other scape, I always start with testing the equipment just to make sure everything works before I start getting too far along. I also just wipe down the inside and fill it up with water just to make sure there's no leaks. It would be terrible to get through the entire scape and then find out there's a leak in the tank. I like to spend some time just looking over the tank and getting ideas of what kind of space I have to work with. I always start out with an idea of what I want to scape, but sometimes that changes. For this tank, I originally wanted to mimic a hike I've done before at Smith Rock in Oregon. There were a lot of cool rock features and valleys, and I think it would be really cool just to have in a tank. And even though I had an idea for what I wanted to scape, that quickly changed once I saw what types of rocks I got in the mail. And that does happen quite often, but that's okay. And I like to start every scape by just drawing some lines on the tank. These are the type of lines you'd see when you use any mirrorless camera or do any type of photography. I find that this just helps me really compose the scape and balance out the dimensions of the hardscape. For a lot of the tanks I aquascape and design, I like to follow the rule of thirds, and you can always break that rule, like just like anything else. It's not a hard rule, but it is something that really helps out just to start with. So for this tank, because I already decided I wanted to mimic the hike I did, I also decided what type of rocks I thought would mimic the mountainscape the best. And the entire hike at Smith Rock was just a mixture of orange and tan colors. So I thought Dragonstone would fit really well there. And here you can see the stones I got in the mail. It's always kind of fun to see what type of stuff you got. It's kind of like opening up a Lego kit as a kid or a Christmas present, you know. You never know what you're gonna get. Actually, with a Lego kit, I guess you do know what you're gonna get. And whenever I receive any rocks in the mail, I always like to kind of just dump them out and collect all the debris, separate the big pieces from the small pieces, and I'll even keep the kind of dust particles and super tiny rocks. I find that these are really helpful, just adding a little bit of touch once you're done with your scape. So you can see a lot of the rocks I got were very vertical. They were still in large chunks, and that's actually ended up being a good thing because it fit the tall tank really well, but it wasn't great for what I had originally planned. And once I saw them, I had two options. I could either kind of push forward and match the design I was thinking, or I could go with what I was given. And after looking at the rocks, I noticed that I could create kind of a really cool canyon with two of the pieces. So I decided to go more with the what I was given option. And this still mimicked what I saw at Smith Rock, just not the scene I was thinking of. If you've ever done that hike, you kind of hike up to the peak and then hike back down into a valley. And it really reminded me of that hike down. It also reminded me a lot of Zion National Park. I've never been there, but I've watched a ton of videos from guys like Thomas Heaton and Ben Horn. It just seems like a really cool place to visit. And once I had a general idea of how I wanted to scape the tank, I just started doing the step-by-step tank setup process. And for me, that always starts out being either adding root tabs to the bottom of the glass, adding some organic potting soil, or some earthworm castings, just depending on what type of plants I'll be using in the tank. With that being said, I already decided that I wanted to really just use Monte Carlo in the tank. It's a super easy plant to grow. It stays really small, which is great for small tanks like this, and it's not really demanding light or nutrient wise. To cover up the root tabs, I'm using 80A Aquasoil. It's kind of a higher end Aquasoil, but to be honest, with a tank this size, I think anything would do, especially just because Monte Carlo is so easy to take care of. Before I add the rocks to the tank, I usually like to rinse them off and soak them in water. It does two things. It really just cleans off any of the debris, which will help with any cloudiness in the water. It'll also give me a better idea of how the rocks will look in the tank. They definitely change in color. I find that Dragonstone especially changes its color once it's wet. And I know I talked about the rule of thirds here before, but whenever I scape or design a tank, I always make sure that the largest pieces really flow well with what I'm feeling. I find that if you have the largest pieces in place, it'll be much easier to scape and plant around those pieces. And something I didn't account for while designing the scape was the filter. The lid for this tank only allows the filter to be on the right side. Originally, I was thinking the filter would be right in the middle, but the layout of how I set everything up just wouldn't let the filter be in the right spot. So I had to move some things around and make some compromises, but I think the escape turned out okay in the end. And moving the filter to the right really made me have to push the rock to the right. This made it look a lot larger than it did before. So I spent a lot of time rotating and angling the rocks in a way I thought still worked well. And as you can see, the canyon opening isn't right in the middle anymore, but I think that worked out even better. And keeping to the odd number rule, I did replace the larger rock with a smaller one. I also added a couple other smaller rocks to mimic a larger rock. I also try to keep in mind that I did want a channel or a hiking path made of sand. I also just added a bunch of smaller rocks as debris. I think in most rock formations, whenever there's large mountains or overhanging boulders, there's always pieces that kind of just break off. And it's really rare to see large rock faces without smaller pieces that broke off at the base of the rock formation. And whenever I make a pathway or channel, I always like to glue down the substrate a little bit. I find that this just really helps keep it in place. It also prevents any shrimp or fish from picking up the substrate that makes the channel. And once the substrate was glued down and dried, I started adding the sand. So I made a high slope with this scape. A lot of substrates don't like to stay put when they're on such a high slope. So I actually also super glued the sand in place. One thing to keep in mind when using super glue is you don't want to get wet while it's drying. It'll always dry clear if there isn't any water, but once even just a little bit of water is added, the super glue will turn white. And I knew that, got a little excited, and then sprayed some water in the tank before the glue was dry. I did cover it up with some sand, so hopefully that stays in place, but we'll just have to find out once I fill up the tank with water. And once I had all the sand in place, I just started adding these smaller rocks, and these are all just decorative sections. This is where saving all those little pebbles and crumbs that fell off in shipping come into play. Sprinkling them around the area just really gives a sense of depth and scale that I think would be missing otherwise. This is especially true when the Monte Carlo grows in, because the little rock pieces will be poking out of the Monte Carlo, making it feel more grown in and well established. I also added some rocks and debris along the trail face. I think doing that really makes it look more like a natural trail. So you can see I didn't follow the rule of thirds too well, but I think it still turned out pretty good. The brightness of the rock to the right really makes it stand out and be more front and center. And then the darker nature of the rock on the left really gives some sense of depth. And now that the scape's done, I can just clean up the glass. And for this scape, I tried planting with a moist substrate, something I haven't done before. I've seen a lot of other people do it successfully and do it really well, but to be honest, I just had a super hard time with this. With the wet substrate, it seemed like the Monte Carlo just wanted to stick to my tweezers instead of staying onto the substrate, especially when using Monte Carlo, which has a really short root system. For this tank, the Monte Carlo I'm using is actually only about a half a cup of the lab-grown container you can buy. I know it's going to give the Monte Carlo some time to grow in the scape anyways, so I didn't want to waste too much. And that is something nice about nano and pico tanks, is you don't need a lot of plants to make it look good. After spending way too much time trying to plant the Monte Carlo, I took a step back and kind of looked at the tank, and the top of the rocks just seemed too bare to me. They were really flat, which mimicked the peak of the hike I remembered at Smith Rock, but they just looked too barren, so I just added some Christmas moss to the top. To be honest, I don't know if this would work. I should have ground up some substrate and kind of smushed it onto the top to give the moss some more moisture and nutrients to grow. I am doing a dry start with this tank, so I'm hoping the moss doesn't dry out. My hopes is that with the dry start, the moss will have some time to adhere to the rock by the time I fill up the tank with water. And then once I was done with the scape, I realized that I forgot to do the thing I always forget to do, which is add a backing to the tank. And I usually use a clear frosted sheet, but I think it's been so long since I've used this sheet that it's stayed permanently curled. I just ended up taping it to the back, hoping it would flatten out over time. The very last step I always do with a dry start is to add springtails. They just really do a good job making sure there's way less moss and mold that will grow in a dry start, and I found that they just help out a ton. So yeah, that's it. I'll have a follow-up video of this tank in a couple months once things grow out a little bit. I'm hoping it doesn't take too long with the Monte Carlo. And just a reminder, I do have a review of the iPro tank on my channel as well. Have a good one, guys. Keep scaping. Bye.